Hi everyone, Jenara Nerenberg here, and this is our new series, Divergent Ideas. I am super excited because we have Josh Szeps here today, and he is a well-known Australian broadcaster, also with the Huffington Post in the past, and now he's the host of the hugely popular Uncomfortable Conversations. Thank you for being here, Josh, and welcome.
It's a delight to see you again. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So before I dive into your life story, I want to check in because things have changed like so dramatically in the last 10 days.
Yes,
So, how are you doing there in Australia?
I'm grateful to be in Australia. Grateful to be a long way away from things. It is one of those occasions where, like, sometimes when there's a lot of news happening in the North Atlantic, I feel like it's a bad thing to be on the opposite side of the world. And other times when there's a lot of news happening in the North Atlantic, I feel like it's kind of nice to be just to have all the upsides of being a Western liberal democracy, but not have to put up with being either in Europe or the United States at the moment.
Right, like right at the center of it.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, let alone being where the action is actually happening in the Middle East and sparing thoughts for people there.
yeah, exactly. I assume that obviously your feelings were very different when the Bundy attacks occurred. That brought, everything right to home. How have you been since then?
Yeah, I mean that's funny because that was a moment where it was like the world was intruding. Like there is a kind of Australian ethos, I think, that um, we are protected in this little bubble down here where the problems of the world are sort of academic for us, and we can squabble on social media about Gaza and Israel and Netanyahu and Nick Fuentes, but really at the end of the day, we've got our own little patch of sand and sunshine where we're all getting along and we're a model multicultural country. And the Bondi attack was a real shock, the largest mass murder in 30 years, and certainly the biggest terrorist attack against a particular community, perhaps ever, certainly in living memory in Australia. And yeah, that the worry, quite apart from the sense, I think, in the Jewish community of being besieged and inadequately supported, given the tone and the tenor of the anti-Israeli protests that had taken place over the previous 2 years. More for me, and I wrote a column about this in the newspaper, was the sort of dreary dismay and fear that maybe the whole multicultural project of holding liberal democracies together was not going to last in the 21st century. That in an era of algorithms and artificial intelligence and the ability of people to identify as their tribes, the sort of encouragement, in fact, from both left and right to think more about ourselves as members of identities rather than as universalist, colorblind individuals, that instinct is being so exacerbated by social media and by algorithms that it might prove more tricky than we thought in the 20th century to keep highly multi-ethnic, multicultural, pluralistic, cosmopolitan societies from having a constant background level of antipathy and from importing ancient hatreds onto their soil. So that was my sort of reaction. I think I'm
Mhm.
over that now, and the PTSD is a little bit a little bit more manageable.
Yeah, yeah. So I know we've connected in the past on, these sort of topics and like identity politics and the woke stuff and all that. I'm curious to hear your feelings now, like just because the world has changed so much from just a couple of years ago. Do you feel like those issues have kind of gone down in salience now that we're dealing with like such like an enormous level of global conflict?
I mean, it's a good question, but it also misses that I was never upset about wokeness and social justice politics and identitarianism and the excesses of the new left purely because I was worried about them. It was exactly because I was worried about what they would provoke on the right. I always felt that once you open the Pandora's box of censoriousness and cancel culture and hounding people out of public life because they hold opinions that you find despicable, once you put free speech on a lower pedestal than the right sort of speech, and
Mhm.
once you start turning the dial up on identity difference and start trying to get people to think about themselves not as human beings first, but as Black Americans or Indigenous Australians or LGBTQ plus people, that you're playing a game on which the right actually holds all the cards. I mean, an out-and-out racist is a better identitarian than a Black Lives Matter activist.
Hmm.
So, and in terms of censorship, I mean, it wasn't the left that gave us the Crusades, and it wasn't the left that gave us McCarthyism, and it wasn't the left that gave us the hysteria around violent video games in the 1990s or whatever that was. It's not the left that has tended to be the most hysterically censorious and othering. That's the right's turf. And the left, it seemed to me, sometime in the 2010s, decided that universalism and the kind of ideals of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Mandela and even Obama were passé and naive, and that actually the way forward was to identify traditionally marginalized communities, encourage them to identify their own small goals as being more important than the goals of a cohesive society and a sort of empathic culture, and to fight for the spoils and to, be proud of our identities and to cast out people who were representatives of a hegemonic white supremacist power structure. And I just always thought that thinking that, to whatever extent I was anti-woke, and I certainly wasn't one of the people who sort of dined out on that as a persona, and I have nothing but total contempt for people who did start on the left as anti-wokesters who now find themselves in Donald Trump's camp, for example, because I
Hmm.
think they were just hypocrites all along. Um, it was obvious to me that the reason to oppose, the trajectory that the left was taking over the past 15 years or so, the reason to stand up for old-fashioned small L liberal values like free speech and universalism and not judging people by the color of their skin but the content of their character was precisely because that was actually just a better sell for the left, and it was terrain that the left could occupy successfully. Once we started playing around in the game of identity politics, I didn't realize it would become so bad so fast. I think the damage that the Trump administration and that the turn that the culture wars have taken in the United States, especially, has been shockingly corrosive. And the fact that you now have Tucker Carlson's and figures like that, and Candace Owens being just openly, essentially white nationalist and anti-Semitic, is much worse than I thought it would be. And
Hmm.
so is the Trump administration's attack on journalists and you know cajoling and coercing and bribing of legal institutions. I mean, but all of that I think would not have been possible had it not been for the fact that the left essentially ceded the territory of talking about why it matters,
Hmm.
why universalism matters at all. But you're right that yes, of course, to at this moment in time to be talking about how silly it is to be doing a land acknowledgement or to be putting how silly it is to put your gender pronouns in an email signature at a corporation. That culture war stuff is completely irrelevant in the face of what the world is dealing with. But it wasn't irrelevant, and it was never irrelevant. And had we not treated it as irrelevant, had we not kowtowed to it so much, we wouldn't be where we are now.
That's really interesting. I'm curious how you kind of had a sense of that dynamic. Are you a student of history? Like how did you kind of sense that was coming? And do you think that's what we're seeing now? Do you think that everything that's happening is a direct result?
I mean, I think I had an insight after being sort of cancelled a few times on social media, quote unquote, after getting into some arguments where it suddenly became clear that the super woke person who I was talking to was not actually interested in debating ideas, but just saw me as a white male and them as, say, a woman of color. And we were a couple of cardboard cutouts arguing at each other. We were a couple of avatars who were sort of stand-ins, proxies for some bigger structural fight that they were having, and they weren't actually listening to what I was saying. It became clear that I think people on the left were wrong to, this is reasonable people, the reasonable people on the left who sort of knew that, the whole social justice movement was a little bit over, a little bit too extra. And, they didn't really support journalists being fired for writing an article about the controversy in pediatric transgender medicine or, about Black intellectuals who might have disagreed somewhat with reparations or whatever it might be. Um, the standard response of the moderate left was to say, well, they're going a bit too far, these activists, but their heart's in the right place.
Hmm.
And after I'd had a few of those run-ins and felt the blowback on social media and then the blowback professionally from trying to touch some subjects that had become taboo because you're just supposed to have the right opinion about them, it became clear to me that it wasn't a question of degree. It wasn't a question of good people becoming overly enthusiastic about the ideals that the left has always held. It was actually a qualitative difference. It was something, they were after something different. They saw the world fundamentally differently.
Hmm.
And it was not too much humanism that they were peddling. It was not an excess of tolerance. It was intolerant and it was inhumane and it was highly idealistic and ideological. And so I just felt like it's not that I was like a student of historical uprisings and kind of
Hmm.
knew that the backlash was coming. What I knew was that it was a dead end, and cultures don't like dead ends. Cultures aren't going to vote for a dead end. I mean, it was so patently, obviously unappealing, this kind of finger wagging, school marmish, scolding, censorious, like angry, resentful, anti-Western civilization. Like everyone has to always be guilty about being a man or being a straight person or being, it was obvious that this was not a good sales pitch.
Hmm.
So I didn't know that it was going to give rise to Trumpism, but I knew that it would ruin the left. I knew that
Hmm.
no, middle America and middle Australia, and with Nigel Farage, middle England, and with the Alternative for Deutschland, middle Germany, and with Marine Le Pen and the National Rally in France, middle France, they're not going to vote for, lefties who cannot have a conversation that makes sense about immigration, about the challenges of multiculturalism, about the roles of men and women, about the biological differences between men and women, about the if you can't talk about all these things that people think are really important and to some extent commonsensical, it was obvious to me that you're on a losing path. You weren't just peddling, you weren't just being a little bit too enthusiastic about the ideals of
Hmm.
Obama and Martin Luther King. You were on a different track. You were selling something altogether different and unattractive.
Yeah, that's also interesting. I think I'm of the camp that a lot of the original intentions were very good. And I think that lately I've been thinking a lot about just like power and what happens to people when they have a sense of power, when they're approaching power, they get close to it, sort of like what switches in the mind. And I think that people in the kind of extreme social justice camp, many of them just kind of lost their way. What do you think of that? Do you think that this became a kind of power game and a grab for power through the lens of kind of morality? Or do you think that people's intentions were sort of nefarious to begin with?
No, 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 I don't. I think almost nobody's intentions are nefarious. I mean, I don't even think Donald Trump's intentions are nefarious, or I don't even really think that a jihadist's intentions when they're getting onto a bus of school children that they're about to blow up are nefarious per se. From the perspective of everybody who is justifying their own lives and choosing their actions, they're they're justified in doing so almost by definition, because if they're not being coerced, then they think it's the right thing to do.
Mhm.
I think the most ideological people who led the most I mean, look, as everything, there's always a combination of different people, aren't there? I think you could probably draw a big Venn diagram with a bunch of interlocking communities. There were people who are deeply committed to a sort of a post-structuralist worldview. In other words, a view that deconstructs everything on the basis of power and looks at society not as a collection of independent individuals making associations with each other, but as a bunch of groups locked in power, locked in sort of zero-sum power struggles. And so there were people like that who were produced by academia and who thought that the best analysis of a country like America in the 21st century was as an irredeemably white supremacist power structure, and the only way to reform it was through probably violent uprising, and certainly through shaming all white people into um, honoring an almost mystical capacity for wisdom from all people of color. So there were those ideological people. Then I think there were people who hopped on the bandwagon because they're cynics. they don't think they're cynics, of course, but basically they're the kind of people who, wherever they see the locus of power shifting and they see an opportunity to grandstand, they will do so. And it's a very human thing. I mean, if you're suddenly handed a tool like Twitter and an intellectual framework like the social justice movement, in which you can go around hunting for people who are breaking rules. I mean, this is as old as time. This
Yeah.
is Puritanism, basically. I mean, the church, religions have engaged in punishing blasphemy since for as long as there have been religions. We're quite comfortable doing this, and so if you can elevate yourself in terms of your social cachet and in the hierarchy of your fellow primates by pointing out misdeeds and wrongdoers and trying to ostracize them and get a mob of metaphorical flaming torches, to hunt them down or get them fired or get them booted off the New York Times or off Twitter or something, then it's understandable that there'll be some people who do that. And then I think the vast majority of people who sort of went along with it are just, I don't want to say cowards, but they're either cowards or they're not very well, or they're a combination of cowardly and uninformed. They basically just think,
Yeah.
we want to be on the right side of history. It's true that these traditionally marginalized communities have been traditionally marginalized. I don't want to be the asshole who is telling them that, who's speaking down to them or punching down and saying that the way that they're interpreting liberation ideology is wrong or corrosive or contrary to liberalism. So they just went along with it. And that's, I think, the majority of people. So no, I definitely don't. I'm not like Jordan Peterson on this or something where like there's a neo-Marxist takeover of the left, which is like intentionally trying to destroy Western civilization or something. I think it's just it's a phenomenon, a social phenomenon are really interesting and they're really complicated and they involve psychology and culture and a whole bunch of different factors. And for
Yeah.
whatever reason, the time was right for that particular movement to become ascendant. And then that wave caused this counter wave, which
Mhm.
um, also didn't need to be as ascendant as it is. That's also contingent. There are a bunch of different things. If James Comey doesn't release the information about Hillary Clinton's email investigation 2 weeks before the election in 2016, maybe none of this happens. It's like there are all
Mhm.
these counterfactuals that I think a lot of things went right for wokeness, and then a lot of things went right for MAGA, and the rest of us are left picking up the pieces.
Yeah. Okay, so zooming out, I know that this has occupied some of your focus over the last several years, but now you have this thriving podcast, and you're obviously a very well-established journalist, both before and now. How are you feeling as a journalist these days, and kind of just like straddling everything in combination with the kind of new media economy with Substack, and how's it all
I'm
going?
feeling great, baby. Personally, I'm feeling wonderful because
Awesome.
I found my niche, and it's a niche that not very many people occupy, which is to try to have the courage to have like there are a few new niches in the media, right? There's obviously the old legacy media, which I think is still fairly cowardly and cautious, with a few notable exceptions. Shout out to the New York Times, which I think has navigated the period of the past sort of 3 to 5 years pretty well. Um, but most legacy media is it's about as real. If you watch a panel conversation on most major network news shows, or it's professional wrestling, or it's a bunch of anodyne people saying fairly obvious things. So legacy media has become more bland and cautious. Social media has become more hysterical, and both of them are quite self-certain. The legacy media is still sort of locked in its echo chamber of what elite opinion is supposed to be. And social media is just a kaleidoscope of self-certain people making pronouncements about uh, why the rest of the media is feckless, and journalists are hopeless, and politicians are corrupt, and vaccines are suspect, and Zionists are evil, and whatever it might be. I mean, on left or right, you're getting the same kind of messaging because those things play well in terms of reinforcing people's prejudices or demonizing people they don't agree with, and pandering to what they do already agree with. So there's become a kind of a shtick that I've tried to be careful about not getting associated with or not getting caught up in, which is like the I'm the brave truth speaker who's going to say all the unpopular things that there's those nincompoops in the mainstream media aren't willing to say, and I'm not going to. And that was kind of fun when I started doing it in 2020 when Uncomfortable Conversations launched, and it was sort of edgy. And then within the past couple of years, it's just become incredibly tiresome. Piers Morgan's show is called Uncensored. Everything is like, this is the real talk. This is the truth bomb and all that sort of shit. And it's often people who are really just saying either things that are beyond the pale in the case of anti-Semites or whatever, or conventional right-wing talking points from people who claim that they're not right-wing because, I don't know, they like gay marriage or something, in the case of a Dave Rubin or something like that. And so what I've tried to do is do neither, but bring the kind of credibility and thoughtfulness of professional journalism to subjects that professional journalists can't touch because they're too hot, or can't touch honestly, really. And so my attempt to sort of find a way to not both sides everything, but to try to get people who are quite certain of their position on something to just edge 10% closer towards being more empathetic towards people who disagree with them, to turn the stridency down and try to have, uncomfortable conversations. Although my show's a bit of a misnomer because it should be called Comfortable Conversations About Uncomfortable Things. The point is basically to take those issues which everyone would get a little bit anxious about if someone were to express a strident opinion about them at a bar or at a work event or around the Thanksgiving table. Those hot button issues, whether that's immigration or whether it's ICE or whether it's feminism or whether it's gay rights or gay pride or whether it's transgender issues, and to take those things and instead of talking about them in a canned, politicized way, to try to actually unpick them and pull them apart. And there's a great appetite for that, and there's a lot more demand for that than there is supply of that. So I feel like at the moment I'm in a good place in the market. The podcast is growing well, the Substack is growing well, the YouTube is growing well, and now we're sort of thinking, well, what is the next iteration of that, and thinking about live events and other ways that we can sort of bring a more playful, democratic ethos to topics that most people would find it a bit tricky to talk about. I mean, I also think it's just it's hard for good journalism to be sexy, and it's hard for sexy content to be good journalism. So trying to have intellectual but funny and captivating and playful conversations, I think I'm also sort of well placed to do. Really, sort of, it's like someone said that the only thing that people watch these days is either 15 seconds long or 3 hours long. Like they either watch a TikTok video or they watch Joe Rogan. And I'd like to be able to do something in between. And similarly, I'd like to be able to do something in between the legacy media and the social media space. So I'm super positive about where I am as a journalist. That does not mean I'm super positive about journalism.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying, because I feel like watching your stuff, it's obviously it's incredibly nuanced. You don't shy away from the details. I feel like you also throw yourself in, right? Like you're fine-tuning the conversations. There's a kind of philosophical feel to what you're doing, or it's very analytical, which is very different from what you're going to see in the mainstream media. And I think that's probably what the plan was, right? Like speak in general terms, attempt to report the facts. But I think because of the rise of, 20 or so years ago, blog culture and then social media and then, now with podcasts and Substack and everything, it kind of feels like there's this whole new field of people who are willing to engage in a deeper way, I would say. And it seems like that's what you're offering.
Yes, that's true. And also, I mean, not just deeper, but also less bashful about having a position on things, I suppose. Like I don't feel the need, which I did because I used to work at the public broadcaster in Australia and host a public radio talk show in the biggest market in Australia. And you have to be impartial about everything. Like you can't, you're the voice of, the public, You have to be, you can't have a dog in any fight. And that is an incredible skill when people can pull it off. And I hugely admire journalists who can. But when they can't, quite often it can come across as being they're just suppressing their opinions, but they're trying to get the stab in anyway, or they're trying to get the gotcha, and you know that they wouldn't do that to someone from the other side. And that makes the audience feel like it's phony, which it is, sort of. So I like having the freedom to be able to show my cards. I don't think audiences are averse to from either side, like to a presenter or a host having an opinion, right? Like I think there's this perception that only left-wing people will watch a left-wing host and only right-wing people will watch a right-wing host. Well, yeah, that's because most left and right-wing hosts are throwing red meat to their fans and demonizing the other side. But I have an audience from all across the political spectrum. I mean, the only thing that brings them together is their faith, I think, that even if they disagree with me on something, I'm going to give their position a fair shake, and I'm not going to be disingenuous about it. So I don't think that objectivity is really the right metric anymore for what journalists should be doing. I think openness and transparency should be. I mean, I'd rather watch or hear from an interviewer who's quite open about what they're bringing to the conversation and is fair, but is like, this is where I stand on this thing, than one who pretends to be a voice of God from on high with no preconceptions, and you sort of know it's bullshit, and you kind of have to glean what their bias is through the way that they're asking the questions. So I think there's an appetite for that, for like a smart analytical conversation where the two people aren't necessarily pretending to be anything that they're not. It's just a conversation. I mean, I sort of learned that from Joe Rogan of all people. I mean, he was very helpful to me when I went on his show in 2014 and then came back on it. I was on it 7 times between 2014 and 2021, 2023. And Joe, whatever you think of him, of the Joe Rogan of 2026, in 2014 was, one of the world's greatest conversationalists, and still is. And he encouraged me to start my first podcast. And he was like, you just have conversations. Like, I mean, you're good at having conversations, just have conversations. And it was kind of almost revelatory to realize that that's enough. That is actually enough. People, sometimes people are like, oh, how are we going to talk for an hour and a half on your podcast? I'm like, if we were having coffee, we'd just sit there for an hour and a half and we'd talk. You wouldn't be wondering what you're going to talk about next. When you go out to dinner with friends, you sit there for 3 hours and you have a conversation. It's no more or less complicated than that. And so I think there's been an appetite for that. And now with the rise of Substack, there's an appetite for that, plus a certain amount of kind of, I guess, credibility and production values. And, it's no longer just a couple of dudes in a garage shooting the breeze. It's now you're producing a television show, essentially, and you have a monetizable business model, and it's a much more, professional outfit.
Yeah, I can't help but think of this like sort of like historically in historical terms, and kind of the evolution of media. And like, because I feel like some of what you're describing, it echoes like academic culture or like debate culture. It's like students or professors kind of not shying away from getting into hard topics on a university campus. We know that's a whole nother topic, but classically speaking, that's kind of what people do in university, right? Then I think about this sort of like other wing of that, which is the rise of therapy culture, frankly, like this whole like drastic revolution and movement of people opening up of their own selves, right? Their own thoughts or their struggles. And so it sort of created this new social norm of like being yourself, bringing your whole self and all of that. So I wonder if you see it similarly. Like it just seems like right now is this interesting sweet spot of all of these forces coming together.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that in terms of interviewing. I mean, I guess because my interviews are so heady and analytical rather than personal, I'm not sure how much the therapification of like our conversations has made a difference personally. I do think that the yearning for a bullshit-free conversation, which might,
Yeah.
owe part of its legacy to therapy, is is part of this. But I wonder why we lost the capacity for that, because in some ways I think that conversations were probably more free of bullshit in the media in 2005 than they were in 2020. So there's a just in the sense that I think there were the penalties for making a misstep were lower.
Hmm.
I can't help but think that technology is partly responsible for this because of the way that you can just go viral when a clip, goes around the world and all of a sudden it's taken out of context and you're fired in a heartbeat. It is interesting to see who's willing to come on shows like mine and who's not. There are some major big figures who know that they're going to get pushback and who are willing to be up for that and to tangle. And then there are others who have a policy of only going on friendly podcasts and think that the value of a podcast is just by reaching younger voters or whatever, and having a yuck yuck. And I think eventually they're just going to get the memo that that's not sustainable because they're going to lose elections if they don't, you know, paging Kamala Harris and the
Yeah.
invitation to go on Joe Rogan's show.
Yeah. So, what do you think is sort of like, do you have a sense of what's coming? What's up ahead? I mean, it's really interesting that you sort of saw what was coming with the, sort of excessive social justice camps and kind of anticipating the backlash. I think we're in this, kind of bizarre moment right now with everything happening in the Middle East and West Asia. Do you have a sense of what's coming up for the kind of media or politics arenas?
Well, let's take those separately. So for the media, what's coming up, I'm more confident talking about the media because there are fewer uncertainties. I mean, it's obvious that the idea of there being this thing called television and radio and this other thing called the internet that has podcasts on it is disappearing if it hasn't already disappeared. There's just content. There's just stuff that people watch. I mean, you talk to a 15-year-old, they don't even know what really the difference is between a television show that's on NBC because it's also streaming on Peacock and like it's also they can get it any like what do you mean? Um, so that the media landscape is gonna benefit nimble shows that can appeal to particular niches. The worry is then that we splinter into a bunch of tiny echo chambers as we have on social media, but we also do that in terms of the media, the long form media that we consume. So I think there's still I'm not one of these people who's like, the legacy media had its day. We don't need it anymore. Why would you want the BBC or, the New York Times or NBC News when you've got, I don't know, some podcaster or Substacker to tell you what's going on without fear or favor, without all of these elites and corporations, bribing NBC with all their dirty money. I don't agree with that at all. I think impartial, especially as artificial intelligence comes to dominate so much of our information diet in the next few years, it's going to be really important to have human beings who are in an editorial structure, who have accountability and fact checking and, layers of editors on top of them. So I'm a big proponent of properly funding public broadcasting in a way that the United States never has, but that is done in the UK and Australia and most rich Western countries. I'm a big fan of, credible broadsheet publications like The Times and news magazines like The Economist. And I think there's no way that a Substacker is ever going to be able to have a foreign bureau, in Jordan. So
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
sort of need the weight of the legacy media for that. At the same time, you don't need the legacy media to be doing the things that it wasn't very good at, which is being adventurous and brave and courageous and, really exploring the whole intellectual terrain in a way that I can in independent media without worrying about getting a letter from HR or, from the editors. And so I think the media landscape will continue to fracture. I think shows like mine will end up being indistinguishable from television content, and people will curate a bespoke collection of content. And I hope that some of that is still from big legacy media outlets. I worry a lot about the lack of editorial control and fact checking in the media diet of modern people, especially on social media. A staggering number of younger people get most of their news about the world from other people who are no more informed than they are talking about it on Instagram or TikTok. And that's not great. That breeds cynicism and ignorance, and it biases people towards the extreme rather than towards conciliation. So that's where I see the media going. In terms of politics, I'm completely torn about whether we are. I think America's role as the preeminent light on the hill has gone so far off the rails that I don't think that's retrievable. So it'll continue to be the superpower for a while, and then it'll share superpowerdom with China and eventually some sort of grouping of medium-sized countries that I fear, if America doesn't reverse itself, will become less and less willing to cop America's shit. And I had an interesting conversation with David Frum on my podcast recently, who was George W. Bush's speechwriter and who was a neoconservative during the Iraq War, who's now an anti-Trump conservative. And he was saying that historically, great powers would not last terribly long because there would be another great power that would come up and would knock them off their perch. But the genius of American foreign policy after World War II was to say, we're not going to be a great power that goes around bullying everybody. We're going to be a great power that really actually gives more than it gets to great powers 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, so that great power 2 can never knock us off our perch because we've got all of these cool allies. And Trump has basically reverted to the old-fashioned great power theory, where number one doesn't have to give a shit about any of the others. And a great power is, the most powerful country in the world is more powerful than the second most powerful country in the world. But the most powerful country in the world is not more powerful than all the other medium-sized countries combined.
Right.
So I worry about a world that is not led by America. I worry about a world where international law and the norms of the institutions that have held the world into relative peace no longer exist, if only just because it'll be very expensive. I mean, once and we'll all feel a bit paranoid about being invaded by our neighbors. Yuval Noah Harari has made the point that through most of history, countries had to spend a lot of their GDP on defense because you just never knew whether you were going to get invaded. And so we're just going to have to there's going to be a huge opportunity cost of all the stuff we could have been spending that money on: healthcare, education, universal basic income, whatever, that we're going to have to plow into defense because everyone's going to become more paranoid about a world in which there's sort of random acts of invasion between countries. And politically, in a deeper sort of, democratic political level, I do worry about liberalism, but I'm less worried about that. It could go either way. I mean, I think either this moment of highly liberal, sort of bombastic, chest-thumping, quasi-authoritarian nationalism will continue to define the right, and the left will find its version of probably similarly unappealing bombast, and we'll just keep ratcheting up the extremes until the flywheel is sort of spinning out of control because both sides are becoming more and more extreme. Or what I hope is that it will discredit itself when it gets into power, as I think the Trump administration is. I don't think he's going to be very popular for the rest of his term. And it leaves with a disgusted population thinking, well, that was a pretty terrible chance we took, and I wish Kamala Harris had been a more acceptable candidate, and Joe Biden had dropped out earlier, because then we wouldn't have had to go through that. So, and maybe like if you imagine how inconceivable Barack Obama was in the early years of the Iraq War when George W. Bush was president. I think there will be someone like that. I'm not saying they'll be like Obama, because this isn't the moment in which we need that. That was the moment when we needed that. But there's an opening here on the left, or just on the center, reassert the dynamism and morality and decency and prosperity the of liberal democracy that could capture hearts and minds, and we could sort of restabilize the ship. So which way it goes, I've got no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm, as you're, talking about both threads, future of media, future of politics, like I keep thinking about the role of academics and, maybe just that's what comes up in my feeds. And so that's what I'm kind of drawn to. But I mean, I think that if you zoom out and you think about the kind of content that is drawing people in, as we've discussed, in terms of something that's more analytical, more nuanced, um, somebody who can offer expertise, in the face of like dwindling editors. Like if everyone's going solo on Substack and you don't have all those fact checkers, like academics are kind of highly trained to kind of go through that rigorous, kind of having to edit yourself and, triple check everything you do. And then I also wonder if, a kind of more academic voice might emerge politically if people are so tired of the extremes and we have this exhausted majority or the silent majority that might be drawn to something a little bit more sane. I don't know. Have you thought
Yeah, I
about?
mean, how? Well, it's interesting. How would academia insert itself into people's lives, and how would an academic exert influence politically?
It's not necessarily like academia entering the picture. I'm thinking more about the way an academic is kind of wired or trained, the way they carry themselves, right? Like there's a lot
Yeah.
of, it's sort of like you as an academic, you have to always keep yourself in check, right? Because you don't want to make a factual error. You don't want to come across as an extremist. There's a kind of emphasis on objectivity, right? So from an audience perspective, as well as a political perspective, there could be something very appealing there in like the tone of an academic,
Mm, mm.
as well as
Well,
the background.
yes, I see what you mean. You certainly might get that in the next American political cycle. Like
Right.
I could certainly imagine the reaction to Donald Trump being someone who's not showy. But in given the way the media is going,
Hmm.
I am skeptical that that will play in the long term politically after we've sort of gotten the taste of Donald Trump out of our mouths, because there's just it's such a fragmented and short media cycle at the moment, and it so favors showmanship that,
Hmm.
like, the worst criticism that people made of Obama was that he was professorial. He was
Hmm.
too professorial.
Right. Back
And
then.
the
But now I don't know.
maybe, but I
Yeah.
mean, but the best, he didn't win the election by being professorial. He won the election through from his stump speech, which I strongly encourage anyone to go back and watch, at the 2004 Democratic National Convention when he was young. No one had ever heard of him, and it's the speech that put him on track to, become a household name. And you will remember some version of it if you're old enough to have lived through the 2008 election, which is, there is no white America, there is no black America, there is no blue America, there is no red America. There are only these United States of America, and you cue the crowd to roar, and everybody, like, people love, that's not professorial, right? That's not academic. I think you do have to fundamentally punch people in the gut and
Mhm.
get them to feel like, I mean, there's sort of two ways to do it emotionally. You can either scare the shit out of people and like tell them that there are demonic forces coming to take everything that they love, or you can give people aspirations and tell them that there's there's a light on the hill, if only we can climb together. And yes, we can. And I think Trump embodies a lot of the former. Just there are these evil rapists who are coming across the border, and his entire pitch is essentially suffused with, I am the person who will protect you from the dangers in this dangerous world. Like, even when he got shot, I think it didn't he was saying, like, they were aiming for you. I just happened to be in the way. It's like this gladiatorial kind of thing of this Manichaean worldview where, and that works, but I think, and the opposite also works. What I don't think will work in the long term is this analytical, even-handed, measured. Well, you know where it might work, actually? It's interesting. I've become interested lately in other forms of or enhancements to the democratic process, like citizens' assemblies and people's chambers and things like that, which are these
Okay.
experiments in democracy that academic wonks like to talk about, but which I actually think could be an easy way to save us from 70% of what's deranging our politics at the moment, which is that people feel so alienated from their representatives. They don't think that
Mhm.
that Congress represents them. They feel powerless. They don't feel like there's really a good way to articulate themselves. They feel like basically politicians are in the pocket of Wall Street and K Street and whatever. And so there have been these experiments in like, why not have, in addition to the House of Representatives and the Senate, a privately funded people's chamber where you get sort of selected like jury duty and
Mhm.
you go for like just 4 Saturdays or 8 Saturdays or something to hear from experts on a big issue. It might be like, I don't know, gun safety regulation or something equally controversial in the United States. And you
Mhm.
hear from both sides. These things have been done, by the way. This is the way that Ireland got gay marriage passed. It was so controversial over there that no politician wanted to touch it. So they staged these things where they would have these big school halls, and there'd be chairs and tables and biscuits and bad coffee,
Oh, wow.
and you'd have a gay activist and a homophobic preacher at the same table with a
Mhm.
bunch of other people, and they'd listen to the pros and cons, and they'd all talk about it, and then they'd come up with a resolution at the end and they'd decide on it. If you had something like that, then I think your idea of like this kind of cool professorial, like academic rigor could be injected into the political process. And the point is not that this body would suddenly have magical constitutional powers. The point is that if, for example, it consistently came to a different conclusion on what ought to be done on a controversial issue than Congress and the White House comes to, then it would be a shaming mechanism um, for politicians. And maybe then you could also, pass a law that would require Congress to have a blind vote on it so that party loyalty didn't come into it. If, for example, 3 times in a row, the People's Assembly votes for something different than Congress does. So there are like,
Mhm.
I find it hard to believe that in 500 years' time, if we're all still here and we're living in democracies, that we're just going to be thinking of democracy as being every 4 years you go to the polls, or every 2 years you go to the polls and
Yeah.
you write someone's name down. We got to be able to do better than that.
Yeah, I think like, having grown up in the States, and I don't know if it's similar in Australia, but I feel like there's this sense of the US is so huge and so fragmented, and there's like we do have a rich history of these kind of like civil society groups coming together, but the way they exist in the imagination is very small functioning groups. Like I don't know how something like an initiative like that, I could see it working in Ireland or New Zealand or something. Like there's something about kind of having a small voting population and like the intimacy of that. Um, I just don't know. I mean, speaking of like sexiness, I don't know if something like what would come out of that would be able to bridge into something so mainstream and be so impactful to kind of influence national politics.
Well, who knows? I mean, everything's scalable. It is a bit of a frustration of mine when I hear Americans say, "Oh, America's too big." Like everything's scalable. The tax system is scalable. If America didn't have a tax office, it would say we can't do taxation. I mean, of course, New Zealand can. Of course, Ireland can. You know how many people there are in America? They're all over the place. You'd never be able to tax them all. And
Yes.
America has jury duty, so that works. They managed to get juries. It's not like, well, how could we possibly do juries in Alaska? Like, have you seen how big this place is? I don't know. You figured out how to do it. How could
Yeah.
we possibly have representative democracy in a country like America? I mean, you know how big this place is? I don't know. Congress exists. Like, it's not perfect, but people actually vote from all over the country, and those people come together.
Good
So,
point. Yep.
it's not a panacea. I think it's time as the media as we know it crumbles and turns into something completely new, and as political norms crumble and turn into something new, it
Yeah.
ought to be our job to be thinking outside the box about ways that we can replace them and replenish them and rehydrate them in ways that are sort of
Yeah.
innovative rather than just like, oh well, it's all going to shit.
Okay.
I wonder what's going to happen.
Yeah. So on that note, and I know we'll wrap up soon. But okay, so Obama, like so much of his message, and I think this was his slogan, was hope. you know? And I think that would be compelling. And I think in the early 2000s, that was compelling, right? That was pre like mass takeover of social media. It was like early days of social media. People were so
Mm.
hopeful and excited about the connectivity of the internet. And it was, it was like pre-breakdown. What are your thoughts on what could actually make people feel hopeful in this moment? Because I think that there's also something a little fake or inauthentic about that, right? Like if someone did get up there and try to galvanize in that same kind of emotional way and around a message of hope or something, there has to be something behind that, obviously. And this is a weird moment to be hopeful. So maybe it'll take several more years before we get there. But I'm wondering if you have any sense of what would be like a hopeful message.
Yeah. In the context of the United States specifically, I would say, not a lot of people have gotten rich betting against the success of the United States. It has a long and strong tradition of democracy, imperfect although it may be, adding in all of the caveats that need to be duly noted. It has tremendous resources, tremendous human capital. It has an incredible economy and a tech sector. And Americans are innovative and they're adaptable. And at any given moment, we're only looking through the prism of the sort of razor thin shard of light that's coming at us from the present moment. But if you pull back and you look at the history of the United States since the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence, enormous ups and downs and incredible upheavals from not just the Civil War, but to imagine living through the 1960s and the president gets assassinated, and then Martin Luther King is assassinated, and then the president's brother, who is running for president, gets assassinated. Like mayhem in the streets. There have been times when it felt like things were existential in the United States, and this is another one of those times. So I don't believe in being Pollyanna and being like, it's going to be okay. But I do believe in being measured and reminding ourselves what is good about a world in which countries don't randomly go to war with each other, what is good about a world in which we try to treat each other decently and try not to be divided, what is good about a world in which we try to bring empathy to conversations instead of hostility, what's good about a world in which we don't instinctively dig our heels in and try to defend our positions, but try to understand what our fellow countrymen and fellow humans believe and why they believe it. We have the resources to thrive and to succeed. And in fact, we have the resources now that the future could be a kaleidoscope of opportunities given what AI promises. But we are entering a transition period. And I feel like, the whole way we communicate has just been revolutionized this century. We're only a quarter of the way into the century. We are a baby giraffe covered in placental goo trying to stand up. And it's our job in this generation to figure out how to stand up. And I think that's going to involve getting our arms around social media, coming to a recognition that being driven, the idea that the information we get about the world should be determined not judiciously, but by how long we hover over a video of someone talking about something or a baby's body being hauled out of rubble in Tehran or Gaza. That is not a way to improve the conversation. So we're a long way from all being lost. We're entering a new period. I think it's the most hopeful that you can be is a call to action, the same way that they would have at the beginning of a world war. It's like it's not that the news is good, it's that this is our job. And in some ways, I actually feel somewhat inspired and excited by it. I got to be honest. I feel a bit guilty about that, but I feel like between the end of the Cold War and I suppose the beginning of maybe the end of the 2010s, or maybe Trump's election, there really wasn't anything to fight for. I mean, everything was just kind of okay. I mean, there was 9/11, that was terrible, but it quickly became apparent that wasn't an existential threat to Western civilization. Iraq War, that was horrible, but But now I feel like the confluence of artificial intelligence, algorithms, the decline of the legacy media, the rise of China, the legitimization of anti of authoritarian and illiberal regimes like Russia's and China's and the erosion of democracy in the United States form a patchwork, a mosaic of challenges that actually do give us the opportunity to be the greatest generation and to figure out what the rest of the 21st century and the rest of human civilization looks like. So I think that's the hopeful message. Like either sit in your basement and doom scroll Instagram or come along for the ride.
Yeah, that's a great message. Yeah, like you're saying with with all these challenges means that there's like a lot of there's a lot to rise up sort of against or in favor of and for people to kind of unite and come together. So, yeah, that's great. Well, on that
An
note,
opportunity to do something. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we got to connect and everyone check.
Lovely to see you again. Always great to talk to you.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everyone.